Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and in today's episode we're going to talk about planes of motion. And have you ever considered what plane of motion your exercises are in? And it's another interesting topic to think about when you're programming exercises for a range of different clients as well as your own program potentially. And something you'll come across if you're studying your Cert 3 and 4 with us um, and potentially out in the industry is planes of motion. And it basically, the body can be or movements can be broken up into planes of motion. So there's three planes of motion we generally talk about in terms of exercise and movement and dividing the body. So we got the sagittal plane, which sort of splits the body into left and right. We have the frontal or coronal plane, which splits it into the anterior and posterior, or front and back. And we have the transverse or horizontal plane, which sort of splits it into upper and lower sections. So we have these planes, and we also can categorize our exercises and movements to happen in these planes. So generally all my sort of flexion and extension happens in the sagittal plane. So if I'm doing a leg extension, for example, where my knee is flexing and extending, that's happening. We talk about that motion happening through the sagittal plane. So yeah, without going into the planes of motion too much, if anyone's got any questions, shoot me an email. I can always do a follow-up podcast on how the planes of motion work. But you can definitely, if you're studying with us, you should find the information in your anatomy and physiology section of your Cert 3, or have a look in Google potentially if you're not too sure. But in terms of today's episode, understanding the planes of motion and where your exercises fit in, the idea is just to touch on why it's important to think about these movements potentially. But more today, I wanted to touch on rotational movements, and where these movements are they happen in the transverse plane or the horizontal plane, and it generally involves some sort of twisting or rotation movement. And today we're sort of going to talk mainly about the trunk, and I think it's an important thing to think about when we do training or prescribing exercise or following a resistance program ourselves, and looking at what movements we perform in the gym and how they relate to what we're going to do in everyday life and how much functionality they provide. There's lots of different goals people train for. There's lots of different reasons to exercise. Fitness is a very, very broad term. So when we're talking about what is fitness, what is health, it's a very, very broad term. And I think one way to look at it is functionality. And lots of people go to the gym and they'll try to improve their aerobic capacity, their cardiovascular fitness, their health in that sort of aspect. They'll also go to improve whether it's muscle mass or improve their strength. Strength training also potentially will improve bone mineral density, all these sorts of things. But functionality is another thing that I think is important to consider when writing a program. And it doesn't have to be every program or every block, but it can be a theme throughout your program to try and incorporate some sort of rotational exercises in there that don't have to be heavily loaded or anything like that. But day-to-day life, you'll find yourself bending over, picking things up, putting things down, reaching up, and they'll all involve, if we reach with one hand over to one side, they're all going to involve some sort of rotation or flexion and extension, or a combination of rotation, flexion, and extension of our trunk. And it's something that if we're not doing regularly outside of just the function of everyday life, it's a movement that we may start to lose over time as we don't do it as regularly. And then once we lose that strength and stability and mobility, it can potentially cause further injuries or lead to injuries down the track if we haven't been training it regularly we've been stuck sort of in the sagittal plane, and we're not doing a whole lot of rotation or twisting or bending of the trunk, it can potentially lead to imbalances or just an increased risk of injury when doing other things, whether it's running, jogging. If you're playing any sort of sport, a lot of sports will involve change of direction, moving side to side. So we won't sort of touch too much on the frontal plane today, but do you do any sort of lateral movements, especially for the lower body where we might be sidestepping or things that are very common in sports? Um, we sort of have all these different motion and movements that we don't inherently train too much in the gym. So the idea of today's podcast is just to bring some awareness to that and think about what sort of exercises you're doing, and cause sometimes some of those core exercises are the ones that we sort of avoid. We get to the end, there's not a lot of core exercises in some routines, and we're spending a lot of time mainly on the compound lifts and isolated machine exercises, and core can easily get left out. I'm definitely a culprit for that one as well, in terms of my own training. But having things in there like whether it's Pellof presses are anti-rotational exercise, so still very good for building stability throughout the trunk, but there's still none of that rotational movement. So like wood chops are good, cable rotations, there's lots of med ball variations you can do that will help strengthen and mobilize the rotational, the trunk rotation. Lots of options with a landmine press as well. Some more free weight options are really good, but there's lots of body weight alternatives as well, like planks with reach throughs, thread the needles, all these sort of things that keep us moving, keep our core mobile and our trunk mobile are really important to keep in our routine. It doesn't have to be every session, but at least once or twice a week, I think is important to keep these motions in, so our body can stay mobile, and it's going to help improve stability everywhere else. If we lose our trunk flexion, extension, and rotation, and the naturalness of that ability, we potentially have to compensate in other areas, and other muscles and joints may be compensating, which can lead to injury as well. So in terms of strength and stability and overall, the body's overall ability to apply force or complete a movement in a coordinated fashion can rely on the ability of the trunk to transmit force. And if we sort of lose that rotation, we're going to potentially lose that ability. So I think have a look at your training program that you're currently doing in the gym if you are. Have a think about how much rotation you're getting in there. And if you're not too sure, get in touch, ask some rotational exercise, or have a look and see if you can find some medicine ball exercises that have rotation, which can be good. Wood chops, the landmine press, again, I said, is a really good one. Definitely something you want to go easy on, and rotation shouldn't be overly violent initially, if ever, depending on the movement and the purpose. So it's definitely something you want to ease back into if you haven't done a lot of rotational stuff for a while. Even some general body weight mobility and reach throughs and thoracic mobility exercises can be really, really good to get back moving and try get that rotation happening. Thoracic rotation is a big one that you can look to do some mobility around, and that can be a good stepping stone into building potentially some rotation stuff back into your program. But yeah, just thought I'd give you my thoughts on a little bit of the planes of movement and why I think rotational movements should still play a part in a lot of programs. Doesn't have to be solely rotation, but more the free weight functional type exercises, even if it's sort of lunges or overhead walking lunges. Anytime we're doing any running, our trunk sort of stabilizing across these subsystems that allow force transfer, and we really need to keep our body's ability to engage and utilize and transfer energy through our core as long as possible. So, and these sort of more functional based movements are really important. So yeah, just my thoughts on that. If you've got any questions or thoughts on how you fit your different movements into your program, I'd love to hear how you look at training in different planes of motion. Do you make sure you get your lateral work in? Is there rotation stuff in your program? Have you benefited from it before? Have you seen changes? Send an email to tom@afa.com.au with any of your thoughts or ideas on this one or what you've put in your own program. I'd love to hear what you've done. But if you've got any other topics that you want to hear my thoughts on, or any questions for the podcast, please email tom@afa.com.au, and happy to cover anything you guys would like me to discuss. Other than that, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.